There are many techniques and many stitches that you can use to gather fabric. But before we get to that, let's just talk about what a gather is and understand it a little better. It's very simple. Every line, just like this chalk line, has a starting point and an ending point. If you would measure between these 2 points, it would give you a certain measure. A gather occurs when a longer line is trapped between the 2 points of a shorter line. How does that look like? Well, suppose I make a knot at the end of my thread and I put that knot right at the starting point of this line. If I would now go to the ending point of this line and take a bite and back tack, nothing would happen because both the thread and the chalk line, which is now the fabric, are exactly the same length between these 2 points. However, if I would decide to pull the thread and then do my back tack, what I've done is I've trapped the longer line, which is the chalk line, therefore the fabric, between the 2 points of the shorter line, which is the thread. So that's the basics of a gather. Now, like I said, there are many ways we can do a gather, but since I'm trying to be concise, I'm going to show you 2 of the most reliable and practical ways that you can gather fabric by hand. One of the ways that I'm going to show you, which is the first one, can also be done by machine. The principle is exactly the same. It's only that the difference is one is done by hand, one is done with machine. So, the first one, we're using a running stitch. Simple. We put a knot at the end of our thread, or we just back tack once or twice. Then we're going to do a running stitch all the way to the end, and we can do a small stitch or a big stitch. What's the difference? The small stitch traps smaller areas of fabric in between each stitch, or smaller amounts of fabric, sorry. The bigger stitch is going to trap bigger amounts of fabric in between each stitch. At least it has the capacity to do so. Now, we can also use gathers to create pleats or to simply flatten and compress the area that we have been gathering. This all depends by how much we're actually gathering in between the shorter line or the shorter thread or the shorter material. So I'm just going to do a medium-sized stitch and we're going to assess it from there on. When I get to the end, before I back tack, I put my finger on top of my last bite and pull. Once I'm happy with how much I've pulled, then I do a fastening off, and now I've created a gather. So we have a couple of things we can do. We can create pleats if we want, or we can run the iron over this and flatten this area. There is a limit, of course, to how much we can flatten, because that purely depends on the yarns and the weave of the fabric and how much we can actually compress the fibers into one another to create a flat surface after gathering. But here's the thing. With this type of gathering, there is let's say, a good side and a bad side to it, depending on how you look at it. So the good side is that you can actually move around the amount of gathering that you have between your 2 points. So you can flatten one side, or you can flatten the other side and move everything to the other side. But at the same time, it's really bad because, well, the thing moves. So if you just gather and you, for example, baste another layer on top and you go under the machine, this may have moved during the basting, and so it's not really going to be in your control. This method is most of the time a lot better to use if you know that you're either going to create pleats immediately, or you're going to compress this area with the iron and then you're going to baste something else on top of it. If you don't do that, well, it's not really going to be the most reliable way. So you can also choose to do this with the machine. All you would do is you would run 2 rows of machining on the bigger stitch or the biggest stitch, and you have to make sure that you start exactly on the same point so that every stitch is parallel to the other one all the way to the end. Leave enough thread on both sides and then start pulling the two top threads, and as you pull you can redistribute your gather. So that's another way, which is actually quite good, but it's not done by hand. I'm not saying it's not done by hand, it's bad. It's just that sometimes you don't want to go on the machine and you just want to gather with your hands. So that's the only reason I'm saying that. Now the other one is done by using a purling stitch, and a purling stitch is the same stitch that we're going to use for making buttonholes. So how does that go? Again, we fasten on, and now for the next stitch what we're going to do is we're going to go in the most forward point, which is this point, and take a bite, for example 3/8 or 1/4, and then we're going to take both threads that are coming out of the eye of the needle, wrap them around the needle from underneath clockwise, and pull towards our sewing hand, which is in my case my right hand. So next stitch, again the most forward point, which is this point, take a bite, whatever it is that you're choosing to do. Before you pull the needle out, take both threads that are coming out of the eye of the needle clockwise from underneath the needle, wrap the thread around the needle and pull. And every time you pull, you gather more and more fabric. So let me just do that a couple of times. So when you want to fasten off, all you need to do is, again, to repeat the last bite just as you've done. Wrap the thread around the needle and then finish off with a back tack, just like you do on a running stitch. Now with this one, the difference is that whatever you've been gathering remains in between that stitch and is not going to move anymore. So whereas with this one we could move it around, flatten one side, push everything to one side, with this one we cannot do that. So again, you can use this to gather a lot or just, subtle amounts. And you can also use the same stitch if you want to compress an area with the iron, then you can do that. The only difference is that, well, this one is held or secured at multiple points. This one is only secured at one end and the other. You can also just, put one back stitch in the middle or every 2 stitches with this one to prevent everything from moving. So you can also do that. That's it. Now you know how to gather fabric. So these were the basic stitches. Obviously these are not the only stitches that we're going to use, but these are probably the most important stitches you need to know to make any basic garment like a trouser, waistcoat or a jacket. Now what I would suggest is you practice these stitches. And with practice I don't mean do 1 or 2 samples and say, okay, this is fine. Imagine you're looking at an object and you want to master this object. So you look at it from every different angle that you can possibly imagine. So what are you going to do? Practice making samples, not just 1 or 2. Make 10, 20, 30, 40. Do them in different materials. Do the long thread, short thread. You do thick thread, thin thread, big needle, small needle. Go up and down. Do it with your left hand. Thick fabric, thin fabric, high tension, low tension. Do whatever you can imagine with these stitches so that you really develop a deep understanding about them. And above all, I would say, please do not forget how to use a thimble. These stitches are a good excuse to use the thimble correctly and master it for once and for all. Apart from that, I would say enjoy working on them, and we'll see you in the next part.